The Gallic Wars was one of the most brutal and pivotal conflicts in Roman history and Western history in general. This conflict set the world stage for thousands of years to come. Yet few games truly capture the experience of what it was like to be a Roman soldier on the front lines. Actually, there's not many games that even attempt to depict that. That's where this new game comes in, Never Second in Rome. It's made by Alessandro Roberti. Not sure if I pronounced that right. I believe he's Italian. This is his second game about Rome. The first was A Legionary's Life, which I made a video about. Maybe go check it out. But that has you play as a legionary during the Second Carthaginian War. I believe this second game has a lot more to offer. There's more role-playing, more action, and a lot more grand strategy. Now, I do want to set the scene real quick if you are unfamiliar with the Gallic Wars. Now, this was a war that occurred right before the Caesarian Civil War between Caesar and Pompey the Great. The Gallic Wars first started when Caesar, as governor of Transalpine Gaul, essentially just think the northern part of Italy, was asked by allied tribes in Gaul, or it's now France. Again, if you don't have any clue what I'm talking about, Gaul is France, for help from a mass migration of the Helvetii tribe. They were leaving Germany due to persecution and attacks from other tribes, and they wanted to settle in Gaul. Now, after Caesar beats that tribe back, he sort of decides, hey, what if I stay here a bit longer and pacify all of Gaul? And then this situation is made even more complicated due to the political situation back in Rome. Rome at this time was experiencing extreme internal turmoil. Bills were having a very hard time passing the Senate. Even critical bills needed to maintain stability. Such problems like mass unemployment and the rich landowners buying up all the independent farms and only using slaves. Slaves were a big sore spot in this time and throughout a lot of history, but not because of any altruistic reasons like, owning people is bad, but more so because every business owner and farmer much preferred buying slaves and having them work rather than hiring a free man. This led to a deep decline in the quality of life of the average Roman citizen, and the First Triumvirate, an informal alliance between Julius Caesar, Pompey the Great, and Crassus, was in power during the onset of the Gallic War. While this situation seemed to have stabilized the Roman Republic, tensions were still rising between all three participants. Caesar was heavily indebted from his political career, paying bribes, buying games and feasts, that sort of thing. All the things that politicians use money on now. Saw the conquest of Gaul as an opportunity to gain wealth, military glory, and to be able to strengthen his political position within Rome. So in short, Rome stands at a crossroads, and that's where your story starts. You play as a centurion in Caesar's army, one that was freshly raised to help him maintain control and subdue Gaul. Now, first, what is a centurion? They are essentially a lieutenant. For a more modern analogy, a centurion is in charge of a century, which is around 80 to 100 men. This is the sort of lowest level of officer. Above the century was a cohort made of 6 centuries. And there was 10 cohorts in a single legion who was commanded by a legate. So at the start of the game, you create your character. This offers some brief role-playing opportunities as you get to decide how you became a centurion. You can either be born into the position or have been raised up through the ranks through experience. Now, it's up to you, but it is not only a role-playing choice. You do get more stat buffs if you chose to have been promoted from the ranks, and you will also get to decide what you have been doing during your time in the military. If this is your first time playing, I do recommend that you start with being promoted from the ranks, as it makes it slightly easier, gives you some more buffs, and you just have a slightly stronger character at the start. If you have played his first game, you will be somewhat familiar with what goes into the character creation process, but it is slightly different, and there are some different stats that should be focused on. Endurance, or how much fatigue you have, plays a big part in this game. Fights are long, drawn-out affairs, and centurions are expected to be at the front with their troops in combat. So I recommend focusing on your smart stats like charisma, intelligence, and awareness, and then putting the rest of your points into endurance. After creating your character, you'll be dropped into a text box menu that shows you your stats of your player character and your century on the left-hand side, and on the right hand is a text box. This is the main storytelling mechanism of the game. That's right, it's all text-based. If that's a deal breaker, this is not the game for you. But if you enjoy Roman history and strategy, I don't think that this should deter you from playing the game. You are then quickly briefed about the situation in Gaul and what your situation is, and you are told to start training your men. You're then taken to the camp menu. This is where you spend around the other half of the game when you're not in the text box or in battle. Camp is where you get to decide how to train your troops and yourself, as well as being able to spend all of your hard-earned money. When training your troops and yourself, you are given a set amount of pips to use. If you use too many of the pips, you and your troops get tired and start to lose morale and don't train as efficiently. And then if you use less pips, that increases their morale and lessens their fatigue. Now, the training system is pretty self-explanatory. I would think you'd be able to catch on after just looking at it. You know, the more pips you give something, the more it gets trained. The more pips you put in sword, the better they train their sword ability. But there are some special stats you must devote time to, even though they don't directly benefit you or your training. For your player character, you have a supervision and administration stat. What supervision does is once it's fully trained up, your men's training becomes more effective. And the administration training increases your administration stat, which can't be neglected because it will cause Caesar, the leader of the army, to be upset, so you have to make sure you stay on top of it. Now, opposed to the last game where you only had a couple of personal stats to deal with, this game bumps it up a notch by having 6 indicators or stats to keep an eye on that decides what type of character you're playing as. Now, there is Valor, which indicates how much glory you have covered yourself in combat. Valor makes your troops like you more and is considered in promotions. You get it by killing people. Next is Humanitas, which just represents how worldly and compassionate you are. You know, doing things like sparing prisoners and enemies and feeling bad about raping and pillaging increases it. Too much of it, though, will make your troops like you less. They'll see you as, you know, a weak, lily-livered coward. The next stat, which is very important, is Caesar's opinion of you, which you will do well to make sure that he does like you. This indicator is important in getting promotions, which you will want to do as it lets you train more effectively and will have a bigger role to play later down the line. You increase Caesar's opinion by following orders and being a problem solver. Like later in the game, a siege happens. I don't know why I'm caring about spoilers. If you're interested, all this stuff happened like 2,000 years ago. Please read a book or watch a YouTube video. So you play during the Siege of Alesia, which for you history buffs, or maybe if it sounded familiar, that is where Caesar's armies built 2 walls around the city. One to keep Vercingetorix's army in, and one to keep his reinforcements out. During that siege, you have the opportunity to hold the wall in an intelligent manner, and if you do so, then Caesar's opinion of you increases. The next stat is integrity, which indicates exactly what it's saying. How much integrity do you have? Do you take bribes or attempt to steal loot? Well, then you're going to lose some integrity. If you're a good, honorable person, then you gain integrity. The more integrity you have, the more troops will like you. The next stat is religion, which shows how much religious fervor you have. You can increase it by giving sacrifices to the gods before battles, and this also increases your morale. Your troops expect you to be a bit religious, so that increases their opinion of you as well. The final stat is troop opinion, which indicates how much they like you. This is determined by the rest of your stats and being nice to the troops. And it does pay off because, you know, if you scratch their back, they'll scratch yours. Maybe you need help scaling a wall. You can ask your troops for help. Only if they like you, though. All these decisions and stats just sort of influence what type of character you're playing, and then it also affects some flavor text within the game. You know, how your character thinks about things that are happening. Like if you have high Humanitas, you're going to be upset when a battle doesn't happen because you want a bunch of loot. This will lead to low morale, and your character will talk about it differently. If you have high Humanitas and a battle doesn't occur, your morale increases because you're happy that more innocent people don't have to suffer. So now on to the actual meat and potatoes of the games, the actual battles. So as established before, unlike the first game, you do more than just fight as a single man, although there is some of that. You're in charge of your century. This is done in a battle menu. The most basic way to explain it, this is sort of a, ABCs of how to battle, is that you and your enemy both have a cohesion stat. This is essentially your health bar. You want to reduce your enemies to 0 and keep yours high. When battling, there is a slider to determine how your century is acting. There is overly cautious, steadfast, fierce, and all out. These all offer different modifiers and affect the dice rolls that are used in battle. That's right, this is a dice system. But they also affect a balance score. You do not want the balance to go above 5 or below -5. Otherwise, you get hit with steep penalties. The amount of balance you have depends on your stance. An overly cautious stance gives you a -2 balance, while an all-out stance gives you a +3. Steadfast giving you a +1. So make sure to keep an eye on that number because it all affects fatigue. Fatigue is very important in this game. If you or your men become too tired, they will become useless. The more tired you are, the steeper the penalties are. And some of these battles are very long, so make sure you're keeping an eye on that. When you attack, depending on sort of a bunch of different stats that the game computes, you will be given a dice roll. You want higher dice rolls than your enemy because the first dice roll decides who has more momentum. Now, whoever has more momentum will then get the opportunity to attack. They then have to pass more dice rolls to make sure that they have enough stamina and energy to complete the attack. If they do, then there are more dice rolls, which then decides if you actually kill any of the opponents. That is the very basic system of how all the battles work. I'm sure you're looking at the screen at the battle I have up right now and are maybe a little confused, but trust me, once you play, it becomes simple to understand but hard to master. Much like his previous games, as I've established, all fights are decided by dice rolls and RNG. Of course, your stats determine how hard or easy the dice rolls are, but sometimes luck is not going to favor you. It's a lot like that XCOM bullshit. A 99 chance to hit also means a 1% chance to miss. Remember that anything can happen. In individual fights, whether it's you versus another enemy or maybe one of your underlings under you fighting, it's very similar to the first game, where you decide what stance you want to take, and then you can either attack, defend, use your shield, feint a strike. It's pretty basic and a lot easier to understand than the large-scale combat. Now, what's the story of this game? As I said, it is a faithful retelling of the Gallic Wars. You fight through the whole thing, and then it ends right before Caesar is going to march on Rome. The game is in early access, so only half the game is out. Once it's complete, the rest of the game will cover the Caesarian Civil War. But even with only half the game being out, there is still around 10 to 15 hours of content to play through. I think the story is really interesting. There's some choices to make. Although obviously with you being a low-level officer, you have no real effect on the grander story. Nothing you're going to do is going to affect the end goal of the Gallic Wars ending. But you do get to live and fight through all of it. Now, if you have played the first game, there are some key differences. There is no meta progression. What do I mean by that? In the first game, when you would create your character, you would get a certain amount of points to put into your stats at the start of the game. And the way you got those points was decided by how far you got into the game previously, or your last run. It was permadeath. So the farther you got into the run, the stronger your next character would be. In this game, there is no permadeath. You can just go back to a previous save. So there is no meta progression. Once you beat the game, there are no special stats or benefits. There is no new game plus. Your next character is just going to be set up exactly how you made your first character or different. You get nothing gained, nothing lost. So I see people say that this limits replayability, but I disagree. You can still play the game again, but with different stats, different moral choices, different things to do. I believe that this game is great for all history fans or strategy fans, although there is a lot of overlap within that. I would give it a pretty solid 8.5 out of 10. Now, there is another thing I want to talk about not related to the game. It's more so a question for you, the viewer, on who you would support in the Caesarian Civil War. Caesar or Pompey? Who do you think was more legitimate? I think I lean towards Pompey, or more specifically Cato the Younger. I think he's probably the most moral person in the whole conflict. I mean, what Caesar was doing was without a doubt illegal and against what the Senate wished. But then also, I mean, the Senate themselves are not king. The Roman citizens were unhappy. And then also, some of the stuff they were doing and the ultimatum that they gave him at the end of the war sort of forced his hand. He would either have to return to Rome as a prisoner or return to Rome at the head of an army. And then not to mention with the Senate sort of, playing games with the dates of his governorship. And it's not like Pompey was some great protector of Republican values. He was the sole consul in Rome, even though there's always supposed to be two. And, I mean, I will say I think Caesar was a tyrant, but he was a benevolent one. Almost everyone who surrendered was offered mercy. I mean, he grew up during Sulla's time, so he knew how frightening it was for people during the Civil War. And you can argue that the political policies he favored were crucial for Rome to survive. But, I mean, I don't know. Do the ends justify the means? I think ultimately he was just a tyrannical strongman. But, I don't know. He did do good things for Rome. I often wonder how he would think of Caesar had he lost the Civil War. Obviously, he wouldn't be this, massive historical figure that almost everybody knows, but how would Roman historians think about him? I don't know, just interesting that he died a rogue general instead of being assassinated on the Senate floor. But anyway, what about you, the viewer? Who would you support? And then also, when you play this game, I recommend reading Caesar's diary on the matter and watching the Rome TV show. I think these are both great forms of media to learn more about Rome during Caesar's time, especially because you can read the words straight from him. That's all I have. Please do remember that Jesus loves you.